Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Rebel Media. I'm here with Jim Goad, the author of The Redneck Manifesto. And the reason I called Jim is because Bernie Sanders was recently apologizing for slavery. A big topic in the news here is, should we apologize for slavery? And Bernie's contention is hell yes. And I've noticed as an immigrant to America, Americans are real hung up on slavery and how horrible they were. And very few seem to go beyond the narrative of America stole a bunch of kings and queens from Egypt, put them in chains, built America, and then by the time they finally abolished slavery, America was already skyscrapers and stuff. So this whole nation was built on racist slavery.
Hey, I'm open. I'd love to see that. That sounds like a great place where everyone's a king and a queen.
Well, I think first of all, they're making Egyptians black, which studies have shown they look more like Coptic Christians. They look pretty white to me.
I know a guy who went to Egypt. He says if you call them black, they'll punch you in the face. As far as I know, and again, like you learn in journalism school, if you weren't there, you say that. I was not in ancient Egypt. You can just go on what's available. From what I know, the Egyptians, who are Arabic or Semitic, they did use sub-Saharan blacks, Ethiopians, and Somalians as slave labor in building the pyramids. I don't think any sub-Saharan blacks designed the pyramids, which is a huge distinction. They always talk about how America's wealth was built on slavery. Well, then why isn't there tremendous wealth in sub-Saharan Africa? Didn't some of it have to do with technology and organizational skills and commerce, things that have been established, boats, things that evil Europeans had a hand in helping invent and develop? The idea that all of America's wealth was built on slavery, number one, why did the North win the Civil War if that's the case?
Well, slow down here. We want to keep this numerical. There were at least as many white slaves as black slaves.
Well, I based it in the Redneck book. There was a pamphlet in the 1670s that estimated 10,000 British kids were being kidnapped and taken to work on plantations in America. Who knows if that's accurate or not? But if it was, you just take 40 years of that, you have 400,000 whites forcibly taken to the colonies. All historians agree that about 400,000 blacks were transported from Africa to what is now North America. About 15 million came to the Americas. Almost all of them went to South America. But there's a parity there, and almost every historian agrees that 2/3 of whites who came to the colonies came in bondage. You never hear about that, though. You think they were all slave owners, but that's numerically impossible. Blacks were never a majority anywhere. You had more slave owners than slaves? That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, that comes up later. Let's make that a new one now. What percentage of Americans own slaves?
To my knowledge, as far as the registries go, at the peak of slavery in the South, around 1858, 6% of Southern whites owned slaves. If you factor in Northerners, it's about 1.5% of American whites were slave owners at the peak of slavery in America.
Oh, right.
Somehow where are we now, 150 years later? All of us are guilty for it.
Is it true that the white slaves, of which there were multitudes, were actually treated worse than black slaves because they couldn't handle the heat? They weren't very valuable.
Well, in the Bahamas and Barbados, yeah, they could, or, the South, they couldn't handle the heat. But the reason, and a lot of contemporary accounts say, well, there was one I quote in the Redneck Manifesto. The guy's like, well, why are you having the Paddies do this dangerous work? They had Irish people falling off the boats doing some kind of work. And he's like, well, they're expendable. The niggers we own for life. And yeah, they were treated like a rent-a-car because they had 7-year terms of indenture, so they just beat the fuck out of them. And apparently middle passage death rates were comparable to the African slave trade. And about half of these indentured servants, who were called slaves back then, did not survive the 7 fucking years. What does that tell you? It was brutal.
Yeah.
I'd like to see a monument somewhere. I'd like to see a movie once. Not going to happen, at least in the foreseeable future.
I'll tell you what, I hate the sun, and I sunburn super easy, so I can imagine it sucked.
I peel, yeah.
Here's something I only thought of this week. When we were bringing in all these slaves, 400,000 of the total 15 million, only 400,000. But when we were bringing those in, and I say we loosely, we were Britain.
There were other hands, there were a lot of European, Portuguese hands involved in the slave trade. What never gets reported is almost all the slave ships were owned by New Englanders. They made huge profits on the slave trade. They just didn't have the climate to grow cotton. So, you're not moral. It's too fucking cold.
Oh, okay, that brings us to a new one. White people are the bad guys with slavery, but wasn't it mostly Arabs, black Africans, and Jews?
Again, wasn't there, but the Arabic slave trade, apparently from what I've read, about twice as many black Africans were captured, enslaved, and sent east instead of west than were in the transatlantic slave trade. The big difference was they castrated their male slaves, which is why you don't see a lot of black people in the Middle East. They wouldn't even let them reproduce. 400,000 came here. There are 40 million blacks or so right now. So that's a survival rate of 100 to 1. Not quite a genocide.
No, not really. Well, you wrote an article about reparations saying that if we add all the welfare we've paid out and check out where it went racially, we actually have paid reparations.
There are people who argue that, and there have been trillions spent on welfare and things like that. But, again, you get caught in one. I think the evidence suggests that. But, again, you can't make these declarative statements because somebody will rightfully nail you on it. But from what I've seen, so much has been paid out. And the thing that always gets swept under the carpet is any wealth that slavery created was obliterated at the end of the Civil War. Gone.
Oh, I got that one here. All right. Let's make that one right there. The balance sheet was zero after 1865. So you can't say that something was built on slavery when we were bankrupt.
Right. It was built on, the South was. I mean, you had a wheelbarrow full of Confederate dollars to buy a loaf of bread. America's wealth was built on all kinds of things. This socialist idea that wealth is just built on labor is dumb. It's also built on technology and innovation and management skills and all kinds of other things. Again, if black labor was all it took, there's plenty of trees to cut down in Africa, crops to pick, but organizational prowess, technology, missing.
Okay, here's a tricky one. Now, I don't believe, I think it's a myth that the Civil War was 100% about slavery, and you sent me a Lincoln quote once where he said, if I could keep the Union and retain slavery, I would.
He said, my primary cause in this struggle is to preserve the Union, and if I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. And you can look up, I wrote an article because that Spielberg Lincoln movie came out. The shit that Lincoln actually said about blacks makes David Duke seem nice.
Yes.
Fudge, and
but I think I've even heard Melissa Harris Perry concede that. But let's just say hypothetically that they were right, the left, and the Civil War was about abolishing slavery. We lost 650,000 men in that war. The biggest number for the slaves we brought is around 400,000. That's more white lives spent abolishing slavery than there were slaves.
Yeah, where's the gratitude? Not really. It always reminds me of World War II, 50 million or so non-Jewish civilians died in World War II. Why are there no memorials for them? Again, history is just this, it's like throwing guilt around like a hot potato, and that's why I'm fascinated by it. I was raised Catholic, made to feel like the bad guy all the time, so I'm just fascinated with where people put the guilt. And if you want to talk about who benefited from slavery, everyone living in America now, if America's wealth was built on it, then blacks are enjoying that too.
Yes.
What is it that Muhammad Ali said when he went
Not as much. They're not enjoying it as much. All right, let's do another one. Africa still practices slavery today, and you wrote an article that showed a lot of African politicians apologizing for their role in slavery. There's more slaves today than there ever were. I'm not sure if that's two separate ones. Africa already had a role. We already said that one, so we won't repeat that. But right now, there are 30 million slaves, way more than the 400,000 we were talking about, and about half of them are children.
Yeah, that exists. And one thing that staggered me when I researched that article is the walk from because Roots was a myth. Whites did not or rarely invaded the bush to capture slaves. They were already at the markets on the coastal areas, but about 10 million, an estimated 10 million black Africans died just on the walk from the jungle to the coast. That never gets talked about. Europeans did all kinds of fucking horrendous shit in Africa, the Belgian Congo especially. Jesus, King Leopold, fuck. But yeah, Africans played a role in it. Why is that never discussed? It's this attempt to isolate guilt in one group.
It's funny you say that too, because we're talking about 400,000 slaves that made it to Africa, but millions died. I've heard the number 2 million died just on the actual boat trip.
Yeah, the middle passage rate, the death rate, from what I've seen, is about 25% to 33%. About like a quarter of the people on the boat died on the way over. That was comparable to the white indentured servants coming over. A lot of them died or thrown overboard. Yeah, but you never hear about that. We have Holocaust memorials all across the U.S. The Holocaust didn't happen here. But what white indentured servitude happened here? I don't think there is one memorial.
I can't believe you just said the Holocaust didn't happen. You really went over the line there. That's disappointing.
You can't decontextualize that. The Holocaust didn't happen. Cut off the here.
Edit, hard out.
Yep.
All right, the last one, unless you can think of more. But the trouble with white slavery is it was going on for, when I say white slavery, I mean whites as slaves. Slavery comes from Slav, which is a Slovak. And sure, there was the kidnapping, the kids getting stolen. There was the Irish rednecks brought over. There was indentured servitude. But we also had the Muslim pirates, which, you know, that's why we have the American Navy fighting these Barbary pirates who were stealing white women as slaves, white Christians.
There was the Barbary slave trade in the 1800s, which was huge, 1700s and 1800s. And apparently, like, there were parts of, like, the coastal areas of Europe that were uninhabited. They were just terrified of these boats coming and capturing people. But Slav, yeah, that's from the Middle Ages. The biggest slave population in the Middle Ages were Slavs, you know, from what is now Poland and Russia and Hungary. And a lot of them captured by Islamic slave traders. Can't talk about it, though.
No, well, you can talk about this one facet of, and no one, by the way, is saying that slavery wasn't bad. It should go without saying that the idea of black people as slaves, two thumbs down. Don't like slavery. No.
This is important, and I made this point in the Redneck book, and I made it in the recent thing about the African role in the slave trade. You're not saying that makes it okay. You're saying, hey, it's worse. It's two wrongs. Two wrongs don't make a right. Two wrongs make two wrongs. Why are you only talking about one wrong? It seems like you're trying to stack the deck and, like, absolve your own fucking guilt. I have no guilt over slavery because I wasn't involved in it. But Africans and Arabs were, but you never hear about that. Or, yeah, Jews had a role in the slave trade. Aaron Lopez was a famous Portuguese Jewish slave trader. You never hear about it. After a while, it's like, okay, you're just trying to make white people, non-Jewish white people feel guilty. And it's like, well, I, for one, I'm going to step out of that ballroom dance.
Well, Bernie's Jewish. Bernie apologized. But at the end of the day, black slavery was horrible, but I'm not apologizing. Sorry.
So what's going to, I mean, why apologize to the dead? I don't understand. That's something they do too. That people can only face guilt that was like generations ago, or that they had nothing to do with it. There's all kinds of fucked up shit. I mean, what, a quarter of black males are involved in the prison system? May have something to do with committing crimes, but that's what's going on now. But they don't. Well, I guess Bernie talks about that stuff.
God bless his cotton socks. The only thing he's ever done wrong is apologize for slavery. Jim, I'd love to have you back on the show. I really appreciate this, and thanks for the Redneck Manifesto. It's a work of art.
God bless you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.